Hi, so in this presentation, I'm going to go through a quick analysis of Preludes by T.S. Eliot. If you ever want to remind yourself about what this poem is all about, you only have to think about the title of the poem, Preludes. So, in musical terms, a prelude is a single movement work that explores a particular mood, and it's a pretty appropriate title because Eliot is doing the same thing in this poem. Francis Dickey writes that the musical illusion of the title suggests that the focus of each poem is a state of mind, atmosphere, or impression, rather than a determinate event or character. But we need to ask ourselves, what is that atmosphere that Eliot is trying to capture? And to answer that question, we need to think back to the figure of the flaneur. So, as we know, modernists were really drawn to this figure of the city wanderer, the amateur investigator of the city. And Baudelaire believed that the flaneur's purpose was to find that indefinable something that we may be allowed to call modernity. Preludes, with its portrait of city street life, recalls that figure of the flaneur. So, with that in mind, we can see that Eliot's purpose is the same as the flaneur's. He wants to capture the mood of modernity. So, it's the atmosphere of modern life that Eliot wants to capture in this poem. And Lyndall Gordon, who's one of Eliot's biographers, says that Preludes is an evocation of Eliot's disgust with the debasement of the human condition. So, observing the city around him, Eliot saw man's modern existence as wasteful, rudderless, or directionless, without a sense of hope or spiritual purpose. And so that worldview is reflected in this poem, which depicts modern or particularly urban life as broken, morally bankrupt, monotonous, and meaningless. So in this video, I'm going to cover how Eliot's Preludes captures what he sees as modernity, and this will include a discussion of the poem's representation of dehumanization, debasement, monotony, and meaninglessness. So first, let's have a look at the first one on the list, dehumanization. So I want to remind you of this from Ninon Rodriguez. So he writes that for the modernist, nature becomes irrelevant and passé, for the city supersedes nature as the life force. Why would the modernists shift their interest from nature and onto the city? The first reason is an obvious one. This is the time when so many left the countryside to make their fortunes in the city, the new capital of culture and technology, the new artificial paradise. But more importantly, the city is the place where man is dehumanized by so many degenerate forces. Thus, the city becomes the locus where modern man is microscopically focused on and dissected. In the final analysis, the city becomes the cruel devourer, a cemetery for lost souls. So, in Preludes, Eliot really takes this idea as his central thesis, and he presents a vision of mankind that is dehumanized and devoured by the domineering force of the city. So man's spiritual life has been replaced with the new gods of capital, culture, and technology. And the city becomes the altar upon which mankind offers itself as a kind of sacrifice. And you can think to that scene from Metropolis where Moloch emerges from the machine to see how that idea is visually represented by Fritz Lang. But we're interested in how Eliot represents this idea with language. So let's have a look at some of that language. So this is a poem about people's lives in the city, but interestingly, for most sort of the poem, or for much of the poem, I'd say that people are curiously absent. And there's a nice illustration of this in the last line of the first section, and then the lighting of the lamps. So we can notice how Eliot's syntax, the way that he constructs that sentence, how it elides or removes the presence of the lamplighter, the person who is lighting the lamp, and it shifts focus onto the city's infrastructure. And notably, something that marks the passage of time, but we'll get to a discussion of time later. But in obscuring references to any specific people or person, Eliot begins to suggest the loss of individuality that is occurring in the world around him. But the people in the poem aren't simply hidden, they're atomized or broken down. And the most obvious way that this occurs is through his use of synecdoche, where a part of something is used to represent the whole or vice versa. So, with the exception of the third section, Eliot uses synecdoche to refer to the city's people. So they're merely feet that press, hands that raise shades, fingers stuffing pipes, and eyes that view. So, in referring to people this way, Eliot makes literal the belief that the city dissects and dehumanizes individuals. So no consciousness is evident in these people. They are simply their body parts, their hands, their eyes. And in fact, it's the street is the only consciousness. Or it's the only thing that has a consciousness in the poem. It's personified. It waits impatient to assume the world. So Eliot sort of confronting the reader, questioning, is modern man even man anymore? Or, has he, living in the city, become a cog in the machine of capital? So let's move on to the subject of debasement and its presence throughout Preludes. And again, I want us to look at Neon Rodriguez, who has a handy summary for us on the modernist perspective. So he writes that modernism had at its basis the rejection of European culture for having become too corrupt, complacent, and lethargic, ailing because it was bound by the artificialities of a society that was too preoccupied with image and too scared of change. So Eliot shared these same concerns with the moral bankruptcy of modern life, and Preludes captures his feelings of humanity's debasement at the hands of modernity. And we can get an immediate sense of that debasement through Eliot's diction throughout the poem. So, we can consider these adjectives or verbs or nouns that describe the texture of city life: burnt out, smoky, gusty, grimy scraps, withered, vacant lots, beat, broken blinds, lonely, stale, trampled, muddy, pressed, dingy gutters, soiled hands, trampled and blackened. So the result, of these sort of, accumulating descriptions of modern life is this characterization of the city or modern life as broken, hard, unrelenting, fractured, ugly, and tainted. And, you can think as well of that image of the sparrow in the gutters. And that's kind of, a direct rebuke to the romantic values of nature's sacredness. The bird, now must exist literally among mankind's filth. Eliot wants to consider that this is the world that we have built for ourselves. And his representation of that world forms an objective correlative for humanity's broken spiritual state and its debasement. But it's really the third section that most overtly explores this theme. In it, Eliot develops the image of a sex worker who lies on her bed. He writes, "You dozed and watched the night revealing the thousand sordid images of which your soul was constituted. They flickered against the ceiling." So Eliot describes this woman's soul as metaphorically constituting of a thousand sordid images, so suggesting that her existence, some sort of inherent aspect to her existence, is compromised, it's spiritually corrupt. Her existence is tainted, and it's her knowledge of this, that she knows that she's compromised and tainted, that occupies her mind. It torments her as she attempts to sleep. So when Eliot writes that she had such a vision of the street as the street hardly understands, he implies that this woman, consumed by inner moral conflict and the knowledge of her sordid past, knows the modern condition better than most people on the street. Not because she observes the moral debasement like the impartial flaneur or Eliot, but because she embodies it. So Eliot treats this woman, or presents this woman, as a symbol of humanity's brokenness, its vapidity, its immorality. And I want to note, just as an aside, that we should think critically about who Eliot holds up to be symbolic of mankind's debasement, and why it's a woman, a sex worker, a person without the comforts and safeties of wealth that Eliot enjoyed. But let's have a look at a different preoccupation now of Eliot's: time, and specifically monotony. So Eliot was really interested in the way that people experienced time in subjective ways. So the sex worker might feel like she waits for, an intolerable lifetime as she dozes in her bed waiting for morning to arrive. But in objective reality, she only waits through the night. So there are two worlds. There's the inner subjective world, which, Eliot, we've already covered, Eliot believes is compromised. And there's the objective world, which is unfeeling and oppressive. And we're reminded of that objective world in the motif of time, the mention of 6 o'clock and 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock. And these temporal references, these references to time, allude to the fact that the world, or the city, moves at an impersonal and imperious pace. It is indifferent to humanity. Life and time is presented as monotonous and oppressive. And we can even see these two worlds reflected in the poem's form. We have the wandering, unfocused, subjective world of the narrator reflected in that free verse form. And we've got the ordered numbering of the poem into discrete sections. So these two worlds, these two realities, exist side by side in contradiction with the other. And, that free verse kind of rambling is kept in line by the numbered sections. It cannot escape it. So we've got as well the short line length that surrounds that's used throughout the poem, and that forces a sprightly pace, which is appropriate considering the rapid pace of life in the city. But he uses these rhymes throughout the poem to give it an unusual rhythm. So if we look at the first section of the poem, we have rhymes between passageways and days, raps, scraps, feet, beat, street, lots, pots, stamps, lamps. And when you read the poem out loud, these rhymes force you into this rhythm that pulls you along, gives a sense of sort of momentum. Not regular, but it's there. But the third line of the stanza interrupts that rhythm. And again, the interplay between those rhythms and the way that line of 6 o'clock interrupts that, it suggests again that those two worlds continue to struggle in their existence up against one another. Eliot seems to be suggesting in the way that 6 o'clock interjects there that time's monotonous rhythm is inescapable. Or we could also consider the way that the fourth poem returns to the same time of day as the first, which is dusk. And Eliot is reminding us that time keeps us in an endless cycle, the revolutions of repetition, in the way that the poem seems to come back to where it started. But let's have a look at a different element of form and notice the way that the first two sections begin in very similar ways, with a time of day personified and then a sensory image that brings you to the image of the street. So why does he do that? Well, it helps Eliot make a commentary on the rhythms of daily life. We might feel like our life moves and changes, but time drones on repetitiously. So the images might change across those opening sections, but the underlying structure remains constant. There's, that hidden repetition. And adding on to that, we could look at the final image of the poem of the worlds that revolve like ancient women gathering fuel in vacant lots. And that verb revolve implies unwavering repetition. And, so we can see it being suggestive of the monotonous, meaningless rhythm of our modern world. The final theme that I want to discuss is humanity's lack of purpose and fulfillment. And in Preludes, Eliot presents a nihilistic view of existence, viewing modern life as potentially meaningless. So one of the ways that theme is conveyed is through Eliot's motif of liminality. So each of these poems is set in a transitional time or space. We have dusk twice, dawn, and the sex worker dozes in a state between consciousness and sleep. So even the street itself could be considered a liminal space. And we could view uncertainty to be a feature of liminality. Liminal states or places, they're neither one thing or another. They lack a proper definition or sense of concreteness. And that connotes feelings of being unmoored, directionless, and purposelessness. And so the fact that Eliot uses those liminal settings throughout each section, of the poem means that he's able to convey those feelings as the mood that defines modern life. And again, you can think back to that title of Preludes. We talked about it as a musical allusion, but you can think of it again with regards to that discussion of liminality. So a prelude is something that comes before something else. It waits for something else. And that thing to come, whatever it is, doesn't arrive in Eliot's poem. So the people of the city are suspended in a kind of limbo. But why does Eliot see humanity stuck in that limbo? As we've already seen, Rodriguez reminds us that modernists felt that society was ailing because it was bound by the artificialities of a society that was preoccupied with image and scared of change. And that's a notion that's nicely expressed in Eliot's description of people's activity as a masquerade. That's a metaphor that suggests that in busying himself with everyday life, modern man dons a mask. And we might question, well, what might that mask be? How is man disguising himself? And, perhaps Eliot believes that man masks himself with the pretense of purpose, believing himself to be fulfilled, but simply hiding from the truth of his own meaninglessness. And even the comforts of faith, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing like Christ, are relegated to the periphery, reduced to mere fancies that curl around these images and cling. They are not at the forefront, at the center, but on the periphery. So the soul is no longer fulfilled, but, in this metaphor that I've got up on screen, stretched tight across the skies that fade behind a city block or trampled by insistent feet. So, the soul is diminished, it's dirtied, it's subsumed by the behemoth of the city. So this is the catastrophic state of affairs. There's no hope for redemption, so all the narrator urges us to do is wipe your hand across your mouth and laugh. That image of the laughing man evokes that modernist, nihilistic philosophy. In a world devoid of meaning and purpose, there's no logical or constructive reaction. We might as well laugh. So that's my analysis. There's obviously a lot more going on in the poem, and if you went through line by line, you could find lots more interesting things to talk about, but hopefully this was a helpful overview and revision.